This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended to provide teachers of 5th grade social studies with content knowledge to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. In this screencast, we will be looking at the causes of World War II, specifically Germany's aggression in Europe and Japan's aggression in Asia, who the leaders of these nations were, and who were the leaders of the nations fighting to stop them. We will also discuss the particular significance of the attack on Pearl Harbor in bringing about the entry of the United States into the war, our strategic capture of Iwo Jima and its significance to our war strategy, and the importance of D-Day, VE Day, and VJ Day, and we will try to make some sense out of the horror of the Holocaust. The crucible of war often highlights and even alters our traditional perceptions of roles in our society, and so we will look at how the courage of the Tuskegee Airmen helped to change perceptions of African Americans or blacks, and how necessity helped sculpt a new role for women, represented by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. Finally, we will put ourselves in the unenviable position of President Truman when weighing whether to unleash our newly developed atomic bomb on the Japanese or not. It should be noted that while specific dates will be given in many cases for the purposes of perspective, the standard does not require students to know them. Before we can really take a look at World War II, we must familiarize ourselves with some of the prevailing sentiments of the time that were a direct result of the events of the past 20 years or so since the end of World War I. First, we must recognize that the Great Depression of the 1930s was not isolated to the United States of America. In our increasingly financially interconnected world, an economic crisis in one nation has a domino effect on the others, and our stock market crash sent a metaphorical shockwave around the globe, and Germany was no exception. But German confidence was already low from having lost World War I, and on top of that, they were forced, at least by their way of thinking, to accept all guilt for having caused the war, and had to pay financial reparations to the tune of 96,000 tons of gold to the victors, which, on a side note, Germany finally finished paying off this debt on October 3, 2010. In addition to that, Germany had to give up its many territories. So here we have a nation that has lost much of what it considered to be land that belonged to them, staggering under a huge financial debt it doesn't feel it should have to pay, and then they get slammed with a depression. Into this storm comes a charismatic leader who promises a change, a way to get Germany back on its feet, to make it great again. That leader's name was Adolf Hitler. In many ways, Hitler was really no different than Franklin Roosevelt. At a time when Germany was at its lowest, he offered a vision of a Germany returned to its former glory, strong and financially sound. In fact, all of the fascist leaders that came to power during this time got there in part because they offered their nations a solution to the problems brought on by the Depression, the same as FDR did for the United States. And this may help children understand how a monster like Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power. The critical difference between FDR and Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito, however, lies in the definition of the word fascism, and in Hitler's case, the fact that he blamed all of Germany's problems on the Jewish people. Fascism is a bit like patriotism's evil twin. It is a belief that your country is better than everyone else's, but to the point where you really believe your country should just be running everyone else's country too, and in fact, your government is so great and wise that they really should control everything everyone in their country does. Fascism almost always has a very charismatic leader who becomes a dictator at its heart, because that person is able to, at least for a little while, convince everyone that they do know better, and you can just trust them to do what is best for you. And by the time people realize the truth, the dictator assumed so much power that they become very difficult to stop. It was this fascism that led to Germany's aggression in Europe and Japan's aggression in Asia. Now, if you will recall, at the end of World War I, as a part of its punishment, the German Empire was broken up, and Germany was not okay with this. So one of the first things Hitler did once he got his armed forces back together was to invade Austria on the pretense of uniting the two German-speaking countries, or technically he annexed it. Soon after that he invaded Czechoslovakia, or was rather given the part of it that had a large number of ethnic Germans living there, in the interest of keeping the peace. It soon became apparent that Nazi Germany's avarice was not going to stop there, however, and Hitler's alliance with the fascist dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, was rather disconcerting. In the meantime, another fascist dictator rises to power in Japan on the idea that all of Asia should be united under one leader, and Japanese Emperor Hirohito thought he was just that leader. Japan, as a relatively small island nation, has fairly limited resources, and so Hirohito gave the command to invade resource-rich Manchuria, and then moved on to mainland China. At about this time, Germany and Japan signed a pact against Russia and their communist leader Joseph Stalin, and so Hitler turns his eyes to Poland. Germany's invasion of Poland is the last straw for England and France, and they declare war on Germany, who proceeds to gobble up most of Western Europe. Not long after that, Germany, Italy, and Japan all sign a pact creating the Axis alliance and turn their attention on Russia. Now the U.S. was once again practicing isolationism in the hopes of staying out of the affairs of Europe. But Japan was convinced we would not maintain our neutrality, and saw an opportunity it could not resist to make a preemptive strike against our entire Pacific fleet stationed in Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, believing the loss of our fleet would make a U.S. response virtually impossible. Not believing Japan would make such a bold move, our fleet was unprepared and unprotected. By the end of the morning attack, every ship in Pearl Harbor had sustained significant damage, and 300 airplanes had been destroyed. But Japan had seriously miscalculated. What the Japanese failed to take into account was that while our battleships were indeed all moored in Pearl Harbor, our aircraft carriers were not, and we were able to salvage all but 2 of the ships damaged in the attack. Rather than cripple us and make us bend to their will, the attack served to unite us, and a day later we declared war. Once again our factories had to shift from producing products for consumers to making the machines and weapons of war. But since so many of the young men who worked in these factories were drafted into the army to go overseas and fight, there were not enough to perform the work in these factories and elsewhere in the American workforce. Our government began a recruitment campaign for women to take these jobs that had always been exclusively male until now. The character they created, Rosie the Riveter, soon became an icon that represented patriotic American women doing whatever they could and making sacrifices to support the war effort. The Rosie Campaign was so successful that by 1945, 1 in 4 married women worked outside the home, and many of them in traditionally male jobs. And when the war was over, many of them continued on in those jobs, having proven they were just as capable. A riveter, by the way, works on an assembly floor using a power tool called a rivet gun to join pieces of metal together with a smooth-topped metal pin or bolts called rivets. As food, gas, bandages, blankets, and the like were needed in huge quantities to feed and supply our army, Americans had to ration those items, meaning they had to limit the amounts they used so there would be enough for us to send overseas to our troops. Though our government launched an ad campaign to try to make abiding by rations a point of pride, a huge black market system to barter, trade, and even forge ration stamps, which were required to purchase rationed goods, blossomed across the nation. By the time the U.S. entered the war, Germany had taken much of Europe, including northern France. President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, along with Canadian forces, came up with a plan to free France from German control by launching a secret massive invasion of Normandy, one of France's provinces. This coalition of nations was, as in World War I, referred to as the Allies. Because of this secrecy, the day of the planned invasion was not specified, and was instead referred to as D-Day, and so that is the name that has gone down in history. Thousands of Allied soldiers lost their lives on the beaches of Normandy on that day, but their sacrifice gave us the toehold in France we needed to work our way across the nation, liberating it from the hands of Germany. Once again Germany found itself squeezed by Russia on its eastern front and the rest of the Allies on its western front. Accepting that defeat was inevitable, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allies. This date is referred to as VE Day, which stands quite literally for Victory in Europe. Hitler, however, was unable to accept a second humiliating defeat at the hands of the Allies and had committed suicide a week earlier. It wasn't until Allied forces invaded Germany and liberated the concentration camps and found those Jewish people who had been forced to march from the camps to the interior of Germany that the many rumors of the atrocities Nazi Germany was committing against the Jewish people were proven to be true. For while Hitler had been invading most of Western Europe, he had also been systematically imprisoning and executing Jewish people whom he and many others in his Nazi party felt were genetically inferior and were polluting the Aryan race, which was what he called the people of pure German descent. This attempt by the Nazis to commit genocide against the Jewish people is known as the Holocaust, and we will go into this in greater detail in a separate screencast. Now, while all of this is going on in Europe, the United States still had Japan to deal with. The difficulty with fighting Japan is the vast Pacific Ocean in between us. We needed a base of operations closer to Japan from which to launch an attack. The island of Iwo Jima, with its airfield large enough for our bombers to land on, and its proximity to Japan, was the best choice. It took U.S. Marines a month to secure the island from Japan, and provided one of World War II's most iconic images when a photographer photographed the U.S. Marines erecting the Stars and Stripes over the conquered island. With strategic Iwo Jima under our control, the United States was poised to launch a land invasion of Japan. Before World War II, African Americans or blacks were considered unqualified for skilled positions in the armed forces, such as piloting aircraft. But during World War II, that all changed when the Army Air Corps formed the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen was an all African American or black squadron of trained pilots, and the support staff needed to maintain their aircraft. One of the most highly decorated squadrons of the war, the skill, dedication, and bravery of the Tuskegee Airmen proved time and again on the field of battle that African Americans or blacks were just as skilled and capable as their white counterparts, and were instrumental in bringing about the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948. Months before Germany's surrender, President Roosevelt suffered a massive stroke and died, leaving his Vice President, Harry Truman, in charge of our nation and its army, as well as a powerful new weapon capable of destruction beyond imagination, the atomic bomb. So why did President Truman decide to unleash such a powerful weapon on two cities, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, assuring the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians? Well, it goes back to General Sherman and the Civil War. Despite their inevitable downfall, the South continued to fight, and so Sherman's strategy of total war was to so devastate the South that they would give up because they simply no longer had the will or the resources to continue to fight. This was precisely the choice Truman was faced with in World War II. It was clear that Japan would lose, but they would not surrender, and so we would need to mount a full-scale invasion. It was estimated that some 300,000 Allied servicemen would lose their lives in such an invasion, and would prolong the war by another 6 months. Once Japan witnessed the incredible destruction we could level upon their cities, pretty much at will, with a single bomb, there was no other recourse but to surrender, which they did, and that day became known as VJ Day, for Victory in Japan. And so ends our discussion of World War II. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here are some links to some helpful resources, as well as the resources used in the creation of this screencast.